A warm and friendly hello. Welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hoops Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to be having a nice two-part chat with one of our good buddies, Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the show/podcast, Rob's Best Bet Show. We're going to be diving in on a lot of different fronts. We saw Robbie Avila is dealing with an injury right now. His status for opening night, he probably should be good to go, but there's some question marks there. We're going to be chatting with him about how to gauge this injury, what it means for St. Louis. We're going to dive in a little bit on the Atlantic 10, and we're also going to be talking about how to deal with these sorts of injuries as well, as we had something similar last year with Donovan Clingan over at UConn as well. And then with Josh Schertz being over there at St. Louis, we're going to be talking a lot about these season one head coaches. We're going to be diving in on how to be able to gauge some of these guys, why it might be best to be a little bit timid early on them, and then perhaps be backing them late after a little bit of a tough start to the season. So we're going to be taking a look at that angle, and then we always have to ask what Rob is looking at in terms of the landscape of college basketball, some of the teams that he's bullish/bearish on. So a complete chat here today. And I do want you guys to fire in what you want to hear on this podcast. If you've got a topic idea, if you've got a segment idea, just something that you want me to riff on, because we've got 4 conference previews remaining. The Big 10, the Big 12, the Big East, and the SEC. And I'll most likely do 2 of those within the next 10 days and then bank the final 2 for like early to mid-October. And then from there, we've got every one of these submitted and all ready to go. So if you do have a question, comment, segment idea, just something that you want me to touch upon on this podcast to get you set for the upcoming season, you have one of 2 ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at JNN_D1. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. The other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. Unfortunately, did not get in any of those today, so please help me out. Let me know what you want to hear on this podcast, but hopefully you want to hear great guests on this podcast, because Rob is certainly one of them. He does a great job on so many different fronts, whether that be taking a look at college football, the NFL, obviously Major League Baseball and college basketball, as well as he also joins my MLB betting podcast as well. He is doing an amazing job getting set for the upcoming season. You're able to follow all that he does over on his Twitter/X at RobDFB, and for all of his videos and all of his shows, that is at youtube.com/Rob Donaldson. And Rob, it is always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, Greg. It is always a pleasure. And, we just talked about it, but, the MLB season is coming to a close. College football is full swing. The NFL is full swing. And next up on deck, we got college basketball. And there's already news coming out about, implications to start the year. And I'm excited to talk about it.
I am as well, Rob. And Rob, how about if we take a look at something that did happen in college basketball over the last few days with Robbie Avila apparently dealing with quite a bit of an injury. Sounds like he's going to be out for a few weeks. We don't know if he's going to be out for the start of the college basketball season, as John Rothstein, who is reporting this, was saying that it should be a few-week injury. But how do you take a look at situations like this? Because I don't think that it's a slam dunk that you all of a sudden just completely fade that guy to St. Louis or anything like that. But these are the sorts of things where I feel like we're sort of in the hunting and gathering stage to be getting set for the upcoming college basketball season. I think that this is very much something that you want to circle, star, and be checking in on at the very minimum once every few days.
Yeah, and one thing I will say is preseason injury in particular is one of those things that has different consequences for different teams. We saw Steel Ventures go down for Gonzaga, and that was more of a luxury piece. And that Gonzaga is still going to be a great team regardless. Last year for Florida, we saw a high, impact and transfer in, and Zion Poland missed the first month of the season as well. And, Florida obviously, had their season play out the way that it did. But, that was one of those things too, where I felt like if they had him in the early goings, maybe things do sway a little bit different. And when you are looking at St. Louis and you're comparing them to, some of these bigger schools, yes, they have a lot of hype, but it's still the A10, and how many teams can actually get in to the dance from this league? That's a good question. And if they do start off a little bit slow, that could be consequential.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think that that St. Louis team is really going to need Robbie Avila, because he comes over Josh Schertz. So he's big in just having the rest of the guys that are unfamiliar with Josh Schertz be able to know what they're getting in the offense. He certainly is going to be the focal point, as he was a season ago. And I feel like that might be, for lack of a better term, I don't think that I'm speaking in hyperbole or overstating it, he might be one of the most meaningful players to their respective teams in all of college basketball.
Oh, 100%. And what I will say, and this is a kudos to Josh Schertz and his ability to pull in guys that weren't just from Indiana State, but sitting on the bench behind Robbie Avila, and maybe even was a guy who was going to get a lot of minutes regardless, is Kalu Anya from Brown. And this is another guy that he can handle the ball up at the top of the key. He's not great behind the three-point line like a Robbie Avila, but he is one of those dudes who does have some mid-range game. He can post up down low, and he's going to be a versatile piece on the defensive end. And that's going to be a guy now who's being thrust into the fold. And he wasn't part of St. Louis's roster last year. He wasn't part of Indiana State and Josh Schertz's lineup either. And so just being active in the portal is already kind of showing its, positive side rather than some of these teams that kind of sit on their hands during this period of time.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think that this is going to be a fun team to look at, as Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the Rob's Best Bet Show, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And when it comes to taking a look at St. Louis, what are some of your expectations for them for this upcoming season? Because I don't know if Josh Schertz is going to be able to fully run what he was able to at Indiana State, because I still remember when he came over from Lincoln Memorial at the D2 level, season number 1, and when he was over at Indiana State, he was getting a lot of the pieces in place, but that was obviously during the COVID year as well, where just everyone was getting ravaged by injuries. And when you play an up-tempo style, that's just not great, to say the least. But oftentimes it does take a year or two to be able to get things into place. And I feel like this could be a little bit of a transitionary year before year 2, everything really gets to be rolling and to Josh Schertz's liking.
And that's a good question, because I do feel like this St. Louis team is talented to win right away. But how long is the meshing period going to take? And do all these transfers that are coming into the program really mesh with one another? That's always one of the biggest questions when you do have a transfer-heavy team. The positive for them is they aren't exactly playing Murderer's Row out of conference. They do have a Grand Canyon mixed in there, a San Francisco, and, a couple interesting matchups against Santa Clara and Wichita State, but no real big-time power conference opponent who is expected to be in the top 25 or a top 15 team in all college basketball, which I'm going to say that's a win, because the A-10, they are going to bring it, but you're presuming at that point that they're going to be a little bit healthier. I have high hopes for St. Louis, maybe not in terms of making the dance, but I think they're going to be a contender in the NIT, or at least on the cusp of the dance.
Yeah, but I do think that this is going to be an interesting scenario, because with the Atlantic 10, it feels like there have been a lot of those teams that have sort of been close but no cigar for those at-large bids as well. And how do you take a look at the landscape of the Atlantic 10? Because I think that they are in good footing to be able to get multiple teams in the NCAA tournament, because I look at VCU and Dayton, and I think that whichever of those two teams does not win the conference, I think that they're going to be able to put themselves in good standing. But it feels like the Atlantic 10 has just been a really good sort of feeder system for the NIT at this point, because they've got a lot of teams that they're like team number 70, team number 73, what have you, but they haven't had a lot of teams be able to bust through and be an at-large team.
100%. And I do think that's a fault of the committee, because when you are looking at the A-10, what the committee really falls in love with when you're talking about the mid-majors of the world, whether that's the Missouri Valley Conference or the A-10 or, whatever else, they're looking at those glossy records. And unfortunately with the A-10 kind of discrediting itself, or a credit to itself, however you want to kind of look at it, they have a lot of good teams, and that makes night-to-night basketball competitive when you're going on the road into, Loyola Chicago or a George Mason or St. Joseph's or Dayton or VCU or St. Louis. You're going to take on a team that's going to be ready to go and be ready to potentially knock you off, and there's not going to be a lot of those glossy records. So the one downside, I think, to having a league like this is it's kind of stuck in the middle of it doesn't get enough respect to get multiple teams in the dance consistently. And I also think there's kind of a negative portion of, nobody can really spearhead it because the competition is so tough night to night.
Oh, the competition is brutal. We saw that with a team in Duquesne that got off to an awful start in Atlantic play last season, and then they were able to make that run not just to the NCAA tournament, but also win a game in the NCAA tournament as well. So Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the Rob's Best Bet Show, he is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I think that it is a really interesting landscape, because I mentioned those teams that I have as my top two, VCU and Dayton, and I'm not sure where you lie on those two teams, but I feel like Dayton might have the more overall talent, but I really love what VCU has coming back. Like, I defaulted when I did my projector or finish and put VCU at number 1, just because I think that the experience level is big, even though they might not have someone down low quite like a Zed Key, which is what Dayton is bringing in at Posh Alexander. I think that he might be the most just actually gifted player in this conference. So obviously the 3-point shooting going to be a little bit more of a liability for Dayton than it was a season ago, but want to know where you stand on this, because I do feel like there are a lot of conferences out there where there might be a more talented team, but but I do default to that team that usually brings in just a little bit more in terms of experience and camaraderie.
100%. And that's actually why I kind of gravitate towards St. Joe's. And, St. Joe's last year under Billy Lang was a team that was kind of getting billed pretty heavily in this league. And I don't want to say they fell short of expectations. They just couldn't get over the hump of what the perceived expectations, I think, were set at. They returned a lot of that production from last year and added a couple pieces in the portal as well. And, from that standpoint, I think that's important in this type of league when you do have a competitive conference, whether it's, the Big Ten, the A10, the Big East, whatever. I do think you have to have at least some semblance of continuity, which gives me a lot of pause when we are looking at like a St. Louis, for example, in this league. But the teams that do kind of stay active on both fronts, where they're holding in their guys, they're adding some complementary pieces from the portal, or maybe even just one big player to kind of fill a need, I think those are the teams that are the most viable. And to your point, you look at Dayton, you look at VCU, I'm high on both of them, but I think I'm probably more high on Dayton.
Yep, with Dayton, I feel like they've got more upside, but I also do feel like they have a little bit more of a floor as well. And how much do you have to parse through that as well? Because with Dayton, I think that they're a very well-coached team. I do think that they've got more talent than VCU, but at the same time as well, when you're trying to bring a lot of pieces together, sometimes you don't know how it's going to go. And I do feel like Dayton is going to need to have a little bit of a different identity after they were such a good three-point shooting team last season. And as I was alluding to, Posh Alexander has never really been that guy to knock down a whole bunch of threes.
That definitely is one of those things that I'm probably going to be pausing on them in the early goings. I'm not going to be betting these inflated lines when they play non-con play, but at the same time, you kind of hope that if everything does go right, or at least something kind of stays as that baseline of, all right, this is still going to be a competitive team with Anthony Grant at the helm. I feel like that's at the middle point when they do really hit the stretch of A10 play. I feel like that's going to be a team that either really excels and kind of transcends this league like they normally do, or they're going to be just still in the mix, but just kind of fadeable from the kind of the notoriety standpoint.
No doubt about it, as Rob Donaldson, who does great work with the Rob's Best Bet Show, is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops, and I think that this is a good jumping off point for part number 2, because I do want to hit a little bit more on gauging these guys that go through early season injuries, because we're going to be seeing it with Robbie Avila this year. We saw it last season when it came to Donovan Clingan over at UConn. I think that many people might be remembering that, so we're going to be touching upon that front. And then additionally, let's take a look at some of these first-year coaches, how some of them seem to be getting a little bit overhyped, and how some of these guys that might get off to a slow start can really lend a lot of value late, and other of these guys perhaps not so much. And then, as always, have to get some of the teams that Rob is bullish and bearish on. We're going to be talking about that and so much more next, right here on Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hughes Peterson, now a part of the VSiN Family Podcast. And we're back here in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Greg Hughes Peterson, now part of the VSiN Family Podcast, being joined once again by Rob Donaldson. He does great work with the show/podcast Rob's Best Bets over on youtube.com/Rob Donaldson, and then at RobDFB on the old Twitter/X. And let's dive into what we were referring to a little bit earlier on in the podcast, and we mentioned it briefly, but I do think that this time of year is a time of year that we do want to be taking a look at some of these injuries, because I was mentioning it with Robbie Avila. That's going to be a big one for St. Louis, but a lot of people might recall last season we saw a similar situation with Donovan Clingan, where he was able to play at the beginning part of the year for UConn, but he was very much limited. How do you take a look at these sorts of situations with these players that are injured early on during the season, and do you perhaps take what I think is very important to sort of give like half credit for a player that plays, like when Donovan Clingan was out there on less than 100% and perhaps being limited in terms of his minutes? And let's call it what it is. There are some teams and some players out there that might not be able to have their starters go 35 plus minutes, because some of these guys are just in general are a little bit out of shape. But how do you take a look at some of these early season injuries, and how do you account for them? And is there some cases where you might be giving half credit, much like I was talking about with that Donovan Clingan situation from a season ago?
100%. And to your point, one thing that always gives me pause is when a team brings in a new coach, there already is inherent hype on the betting front with that new addition, or that new hire rather, no matter who it is, especially when it's a big name like a Josh Hurts, who's coming from a program that I feel like everybody kind of knew of last year in Indiana State. And when you do bring over all these transfer talents and a lot of notable names, a lot of people are going to want to flock and want to bet St. Louis right out of the gate because they're going to be the hot start team in the league, right? Well, the betting line is the great equalizer in any type of betting sport. And when you're looking at, the hype of a new hire and then maybe not a full strength lineup, that immediately gives me pause and kind of almost lends me to pick the other side because of that just kind of inherent inflation that you're paying up on the front end. But once they do get healthy, I do feel like St. Louis is going to be formidable. And this might, again, just be a great example of don't bet them in the early goings, but hey, by month 1 or month 2, once those pass by, I definitely think there's going to be some value on the betting front.
Yep, I think so as well. And I do think that there are quite a few teams that they bring in great coaches, but I might be a little bit timid on them in the first month of the season. Michigan with Dusty May, great hire, but again, they might be a little bit too hyped up. Louisville as well, because with Louisville, they quite literally bring back 0 returning minutes from last season, so they might be going through their growing pains early. And then they're a team that once everyone is out on them in January and February, that's when you strike when the iron is hot, much like we have done with Arkansas in past years, Saints last year as well. But is there a few hires that you took a look at this offseason and they made you scratch your head a little bit? Because I feel like when we talk about these offseason coaching hires, we always say, oh, good hire here, good hire there. But are there a few that you take a look at them and you're like, man, I don't get why everyone is on the bandwagon because you're just not feeling too great about it?
There's a number of guys, and I don't want to put my foot in my mouth by week 2, but when you are looking at the Kentucky hire and Mark Pope in general, it kind of felt like that BYU bunch came out of nowhere playing a style that isn't necessarily year by year consistent, and then he just kind of lucked into this amazing job here at Kentucky where a longtime guy, it was kind of getting forced out because of not winning enough. If you want to talk about some daunting expectations, playing that number 2 seed in, conference basketball and being one of the best teams in the country year in and year out, that wasn't enough at Kentucky for the old regime. So Mark Pope, there's going to be a lot on his plate from day one, and I do feel like that's a hire I'm probably the most pessimistic about.
Yeah, I am a little bit pessimistic there. I do like the fact that he was able to bring over a few guys from BYU. So you've got that chemistry, and I think that is so big to take a look at as well, because I look at these coaches that they bring over a lot from last season, because we were just referring to it with Josh Schertz, the fact that he brings over some of those Indiana State guys. Anyone that was betting South Florida last season, that was a team that had a highly touted coach, and they were actually a top 5 team in the country in terms of cover rate. So they were one of those teams that from start to finish, you were able to make a bunch of money on them. And how about you take a look at that aspect of things as well? Because I think that it does say something when a coach goes to a new spot and he's able to bring over a lot of guys, and when he gets nobody to follow him, that's when I start to scratch my head and say, all right, is this really going to work out?
Yeah, especially when you look at a guy like a Dusty May. I feel like he was the one, along with Josh Schertz, that had the most notable core, because at his previous stop, obviously, they were very notable brands with FAU and Indiana State because they won a lot of games. In regards to FAU, they actually made tournament runs under Dusty May and that elite core. Everybody tried to follow, Dusty May to Michigan, but the academic standards kind of pushed some of them out. And, to your point, if you're not bringing along your guys, I do feel like that's telling, because you got to have some continuity. Every coach, when they're going to a new stop, wants that familiarity around, unless there's some toxicity on one or two sides. And that's where, when you look at Coach Cal and you look at, Eric Musselman going out to USC, it feels like some coaches in this league are just kind of there to be great X's and O's guys, but not really great player coaches, and don't really have that bond or that tether that keeps players around. And that always gives me a little bit of pause when you're looking at how a team might perform in a given season.
Absolutely. And I always have to ask you about this, Rob, because you're doing such great work getting set for the upcoming season as you do so over on the Rob's Best Bets show, as Rob Donaldson is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And I want to get your thoughts on just a few teams that you've been diving in on the last few weeks, and maybe you've changed your tune on them a little bit. It could be to the positive, it could be to the negative, but just what have you been taking a look at? And is there a team or two, or it can even be not just a team, but it could be a player or two that maybe you're starting to come around on, / you're starting to be a bit more bearish on?
Well, there's a couple teams that I've really started to key in on as, hey, you know what? I feel like these are going to be some money makers in the early goings and potentially throughout the entire season. And those two teams are Xavier and Miami. And I'll highlight Xavier just because I feel like it's the perfect thing for this NIL Wild West sort of style of recruiting and team building nowadays to have Sean Miller at the helm. This guy got obviously given the boot from Arizona because of, what he potentially did before NIL. And now you're kind of giving the keys to the mob boss and saying, hey, build a roster. And I feel like he added some really good guys to fill out this roster comparatively to what they had last year. And they're bringing in some guys that had some injuries as well from their previous season and didn't really get to fully impact their performance throughout the year. And I feel like the stars are kind of aligning for Sean Miller and Xavier to kind of rise again to the top of the Big East and be a formidable bunch, especially with UConn potentially losing a step as well.
Oh, and I am so glad that you mentioned Xavier as well, because how much do you want to be taking a look at these teams that had guys out last season because they were without Jerome Hunter, they were without Zach Fremantle? I look at a team like Southern Miss, and I'm not in on Andre Cabello, but I feel like Neftali Alvarez, who missed all of last year, him being able to help control Andre Cabello a little bit more, that's big. And these guys that missed the 2023-24 season are what I like to refer to as out of sight, out of mind guys. And those are the teams I think have real value towards the beginning part of the season, because for lack of a better term, everyone's forgotten about these guys that are going to make a big impact night number one.
Yeah, 100%. The guys that missed last season weren't just like sitting at home playing video games. Obviously, that might have been part of it and part of their, the rehab. They can't really do as much, but they're still working on their game and they're building experience and they're kind of learning the culture of their locker room if they stuck around the same program. And to your point, that's 100% something that people forget because they get caught up in all these big top 100 freshmen, true freshmen coming in, and all these transfer talent guys. And those are obviously necessities. You need to build through those types of avenues. But one of the biggest building points is continuity. And then, having those guys that were kind of not really continuity based on the last season, but are coming over from 2 seasons ago. It's like a refiring on all cylinders because they're still in that locker room and they're still kind of creating those bonds with their teammates. And we just highlighted Xavier. That's a big reason why I'm so drawn to this team and why I'm going to be so eager to bet them in the early going.
Oh, I am right there with you. Like, hopefully Neftali Alvarez, Zach Fremantle at some point was able to enjoy a nice meal or two at the old Texas Roadhouse, but you know what? You are still right on that. Them still being around, them still getting to know their teammates, being able to get a vibe for the program. I think that is massive. Just like we've always got great vibes when you're aboard, Rob. You do such an amazing job taking a look at this great game of college basketball. And I know that you are hard at work getting set for the upcoming college basketball season. So let the good people at home know it's all on tap for you and how people can follow along on social media and other platforms.
Well, hey, Greg, I always love chopping it up with you on the basketball front. And certainly we've got so many storylines and so much action coming our way. And for those who want to follow my day-to-day bets in MLB, NFL, college football, until then, you can do so on Twitter/X at RobDFB and also on my YouTube channel, just my name, Rob Donaldson. And as always, Greg, really appreciate having me on.
Always appreciate you, Rob, as Rob does such an amazing job taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of baseball, or taking a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. But on top of that, does a great job on the baseball front, the football front, and so much more. So big thanks to Rob for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops, now part of the VSiN family of podcasts. And if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you do have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of 2 ways we offer those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @unit_D1. Keep in mind, LarzM, name does not matter. So as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. And then from there, you're able to fire in whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And I'm going to be coming at you guys every single day on this podcast, regular season and off season. So I do want to hear what you want to have me dive in on the podcast, as we're 5 weeks away from the start of the college basketball season. So I have 4 conference previews remaining. So do want to fill in the gaps from there, so that way I can make this the most profitable season humanly possible for you. And I'm here, rain or shine, for you. So I will be back with you once again tomorrow, as I will be all 366 days this year. So appreciate you tuning in today, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.